I believe the Russians when they say they're going to attack Poland next. He's either, in his mind, going to win or he's going to be murdered by his own people. I think Putin is shocked that for the last 2.5 years he's been able to get away with this. So Putin's going to have a rude wake-up call when his country goes broke and his people don't want to support this war anymore.
And we're delighted now to be joined by a new guest, Jake Broe. He was a United States Air Force officer who served on nuclear and missile operations and has recently amassed 500,000 YouTube subscribers for his analysis of the Ukraine war. So this week, Blinken arrived in Ukraine, Jake, and he gave an entire speech about Crimea being Ukrainian. And what was your reaction to that?
We must respect the rules of international law. Crimea is the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Whatever happened in the past, it doesn't matter. Russia as a country only came into existence at the end of 1991. Whatever happened under the old Soviet system, Khrushchev transferring this from one internal province of their empire to the other, it's irrelevant. The past is the past. We're not going to investigate every country's historical claims because there's a lot of countries in the world with gray borders and historical claims, but 1991, that was the cutoff. So this is the appropriate action from world leaders. I appreciate the statements from the leader of Turkey. What Secretary Blinken says is correct. What Russia has done is incredible because in the post-World War II era, how many times have we redrawn the map through a war of aggression? New countries have come into existence from bigger states basically dissolving. But for one country to invade and then annex the territory of another country, the list of people who attempted to do this in the last 70 years, it didn't end well for them. You can ask Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait. So the international community has been holding together for the last 2.5 years. Not even China is willing to recognize Russia's claims to Crimea and the annexed territories. So Putin's going to have a rude wake-up call when his country goes broke and his people don't want to support this war anymore.
So how do you think Putin is feeling at the moment? There was talk of the walls closing in. There's a lot of bad news. 144 drones hit Moscow. There's inflation, the interest rates are going up. And Kursk, Russian territory, has been invaded for at least a month. You know, how do you think he's personally coping in terms of his psyche and his psychology?
Well, I think Putin has extreme confidence in that he's been able to pull this off for the last 2.5 years. This entire war has been disastrous every single step. The second it was apparent to everyone in the world this was not going to be a 3-day special military operation, in my mind, Russia lost this war the second President Zelensky declined that helicopter ride out of the country. As soon as the Ukrainians rallied behind their own president and decided they wanted to fight, how do you do it? How do you invade a country with only 200,000 soldiers in the beginning and try to conquer a nation of over 40 million people? Active resistance, the clips and pictures and videos those first couple weeks. So your question about what is Putin thinking and feeling now, I think Putin is shocked that for the last 2.5 years he's been able to get away with this. Hundreds of thousands of his own people have died in this war. Countless more have been crippled for life. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have fled the country for sanctuary or a better life in other countries like Turkey, Jordan, Thailand, if they can get a visa into Western countries in Europe. So Putin has gone this far, and nobody's really stopped him. The only real opposition he's had is that brief mutiny by Prigozhin. His personal chef is the only one in his inner circle that has attempted to rebel against him. So Putin, I mean, he's fully committed. He's either, in his mind, going to win or he's going to be murdered by his own people. So he's fine continuing to write checks to keep this war going. He's fine with his own people dying. He's fine with his own country being invaded because he still thinks politically he'll win the long game. When you look at recent elections in Germany, when you look at everything Donald Trump says and does here in the United States, and the election here is still close, it's basically a coin flip. Yeah, Putin's feeling confident that if he just keeps letting his own people die, if he keeps the war machine going, eventually he can grind down Ukraine and he'll get a tangible victory.
So there's a lot of talk about firing these long-range weapons. Is this a big moment in the war if Ukraine is allowed to use these weapons in Russia, in the heartland of Russia? Do you think this is a major escalation or a major turning point?
The implications are nothing good for Russia, but Russia's not going to do anything. We have discovered over the last 2.5 years that every red line that Russia has made is non-existent. The arrival of Leopards or Abrams, the arrival of Patriot systems, the arrival of F-16s, the initial permission 4 months ago to use Gimler's rounds within 100 kilometers on Russian territory. The United States is still going to impose restrictions on the use of ATACMS or, for example, British Storm Shadow cruise missiles. Don't hit thermal power plants with them. Don't hit oil refineries. Don't hit oil depots. Those are purely civilian targets, even though obviously they contribute to the Russian war machine. But any military bases, anything that is indisputably a valid military target, yes, they're going to start getting lit up the next 2 weeks, and it's going to be a bad month for the Russians as far as their logistics supply chains. If you can make things go boom and set them on fire 300 kilometers deep into Russia, well, now supplies, now troop rotations going into the occupied territories, getting to the front lines. Yeah, there's going to be a trickle-down effect, and this will improve Ukraine's position on the battlefield.
So we've got to ask the question. It's taken over 2 years for the West to allow Ukraine to strike with these long-range weapons. What do you think has changed? Why is it only happening now?
Fear of nuclear war. But also, I'm convinced that when we talk about the West is not fully united.
Yeah.
If you talk to former Soviet republics or the Scandinavian countries, Eastern Europe, their opinion of the Russians is a little bit different than if you get farther west. And we need to have a broader conversation about Russian money infiltrating our democracies and corrupting us. The ties that the West made with the Russians will buy your gas and natural resources in exchange, as long as the oil and gas keeps flowing. Will overlook your backsliding into authoritarianism. All the signs were there, from the 2008 election in Russia to Putin coming back in 2012. It's not normal to amend your constitution so the guy in charge can stay there for life. That's not a democracy. But what the Russians have been doing the last 20 plus years is investing, buying property, entrenching their own mafia state into our Western democracies. So the business ties, the connections, the money is there everywhere in every Western capital. It's not just one country that's at fault or at risk here. So this entire time, it's all been about how can we get back to business as normal. Now, on my YouTube channel, I've been making the argument for 2.5 years that's never going to happen. Make the divorce permanent. I follow Gary Kasparov, and I agree with what he says. The Russian people will never be free, will never have normal relations again until the Putin regime collapses. Make it happen faster. Don't fear it. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the world is better off. Let's go for it.
So, Jake, what do you think would actually happen if Putin was toppled? I mean, and, Russia would be destabilized, but the whole Soviet Union fell apart in 1991 and we didn't have World War III. So I know people are scared of any thought of, rogue nukes and a destabilized Russia. But what do you think would actually happen if Putin's project and his sort of grip loosens?
Let's be honest about this debate. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the mandate was have all the nukes go back to Russia. Those are now Russia's nukes. So Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine had Soviet nuclear weapons on their territory. And part of the deal to have this peaceful collapse of the Soviet Empire was all the nukes have to retreat back into mainland Russia. Well, if Russia breaks up, if Russia collapses, where do the nukes go? There is no inner core territory. I mean, I guess you could create a new country of Muscovia and then say that 6,000 nuclear warheads spread across, the Caucasus and Siberia have to retreat there. I guess that's a plan. But yeah, the fear is that if Russia fails and breaks up, we'll have regional warlords fighting over gas fields and mineral deposits, and they all have nuclear weapons. So that's the fear, that's the concern. In that nightmare scenario, millions would die, mostly Russians. To my response to that is, Putin didn't give us a choice. I don't want that future. I don't want millions to die in some kind of regional nuclear war. But we can't just let Putin have whatever he wants. Appeasing a dictator never prevents the next war.
So in the presidential debate this week, Kamala Harris basically said that if Donald Trump was in power and he'd got what he wanted, Putin would be sitting in Kiev right now, and his next sort of point of mission, this need for constant war, he'd be looking to Poland. Do you think that's legitimate? Also, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Do you think that was a real danger if Putin had managed to take Ukraine in those 3 days as he planned?
I don't have to think that. I don't have to have that opinion. All I have to do is listen to the Russians and what the Russians say on Kremlin state TV. I've been following these clips from Russian Media Monitor the last 2.5 years. I believe the Russians when they say they're going to attack Poland next. I believe Soloveyov when he says it was a mistake for Russian troops to ever leave Berlin and they need to go back. Now, when they say we're going to take our tanks all the way to Portugal, I don't think that's going to happen. But as far as the Suwalki Gap, as far as closing that bridge between Belarus, which is basically Russian territory, and Kaliningrad, of course the Russians are going to do that. They're going to cut off the Baltics and they're going to take the Baltics next. They don't care how many Polish people they kill. The Russians, for 400 years, have never cared how many Polish people they kill. So yes, I believe the Russians when they say they're going to keep going if they take Ukraine. And Donald Trump doesn't care. Donald Trump will sell out any ally in the world if it pleases the wealthiest dictators of the world. Donald Trump is a dictator wannabe. He's not very good at it. He's not very competent. He lost in 2020 and was removed from power. And he's not going to be allowed to come back by the American people this November.
So, Jake, I want to ask you about the Tenet scandal that unfolded last week about the social media super spreaders getting sort of millions in payments. It's one of the clearest pieces, small, apparently, there's much more, of Russian interference in Western democracies in recent years, really. Since the Cold War, you could almost say. Did it surprise you when you read about these right-wing personalities taking Kremlin gold?
It didn't surprise me, but I'm here on YouTube every day battling, and I look at my channel and I look at my views and I look at the limits of what one human being can do on their own. I have over 500,000 subscribers. I average 300,000 views a video. I'm doing pretty well. So when I look at a channel like Tim Pool and I see how nice his studio is, and he's got a producer and he's got editors and he's got a staff and he's got vintage Magic the Gathering cards worth tens of thousands of dollars in a display case behind him in his camera shot. And the stuff he says and does is absolute garbage and he barely gets any views. It didn't make sense to me. It hasn't made sense to me for 2.5 years. So to get this DOJ indictment unsealed and realize, to see on Kremlin State TV, Margarita Simonyan bragging about their covert operations in the United States, how for just a couple $1 million tossed here and there, they were able to get tens of billions of views out of these right-wing influencers here in the United States promoting Kremlin talking points. Now, 90% of their contents, they talk about the culture wars, they talk about random conspiracy stuff to suck people in, but RT got a return on their investment. In the group chats, in that Discord server, they would put out, hey, we want you to promote this video of Tucker Carlson going to a grocery store in Moscow. Hey, we want you to just say Ukraine was behind the Crocus City Hall attacks. And these influencers were willing to do it. They were saying, I'm getting $100,000 a week from this weird company and doesn't make any sense, but yeah, I'll do it. They're paying me a lot of money. I'll just say Ukraine was behind this terrorist attack. I'll say Ukraine, it's their fault for starting this war because of NATO expansion. And for me as an American, I'm devastated that I've lost tens of millions of my compatriots. Tens of millions of Americans have now been radicalized by these right-wing influencers taking millions from the Russians to just think Ukraine is this is what Tim Pool said, Ukraine is the greatest enemy of the United States in the world today. The United States owes an apology to Russia. Tens of millions of Americans now believe this because their favorite right-wing influencers have been saying it for the last year.
So, Jake, finally, can I just ask you about the sort of physical situation on the ground in Ukraine right now? You know, there seem to be retreats, advances in the wrong way from as far as the Ukrainians are concerned in the east around Pokrovsk. Our reporters were there last week, and it seems that town, that city could fall. And it's a huge railway city. It connects other towns along the ridge of Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. And of course, the Russians apparently have started a counteroffensive against the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk Oblast of Russia. But what do you see the situation from your point of view? What's really going on the ground?
On my channel, I'm not a big map update guy. I do it for significant changes, but this war is not going to be won or lost with map updates. If the Russians take the city of Pokrovsk, the war is not over. If the Russians take the entirety of the Donetsk Oblast, the war is not over. The front lines have just shifted. The war will end when either Ukraine or Russia has some kind of catastrophic economic or political collapse, and they can no longer regenerate their frontline forces. This is what Ukraine has to do to win, and they've been doing it. With the targeting of all these oil refineries, they're going after Russia's money source. Every sanction, each sanction on their own is not going to do it, but it's a cumulative effect. It's a death by 1,000 paper cuts. So everybody in the West has to keep up the pressure on every sector, in every way. You know, the United States announcing their 18th round of sanctions or whatever, keep doing it. Keep targeting people, keep targeting companies. It's all aggregated. Just the other day, Google is now blocking all Russian telephone numbers. Apple and iOS already pulled out of Russia. How do you use the modern internet, avoiding both iOS and Android? All Apple and now all Google devices. Everything is getting worse in Russia. And I hope that we can come to some kind of culmination point this winter. It was disastrous for the Russian civil infrastructure last winter with pipes bursting, and they didn't have enough parts. They didn't have enough repair crews. We're heading into another difficult winter for the Russians. And I hope there will be a breaking point, either economically, politically, or socially. And that's how Ukraine's going to win. It's not going to be by overwhelming force on the battlefield, clearing tree line by tree line or destroyed settlement by destroyed settlement.
Thanks so much for your great insights. Lovely to have you on Byline on the front line for the first time, and we hope to have you back again soon. So thanks everybody for watching Byline on the front line. And if you want to support us, no, we don't get any Kremlin gold, sadly. All we have is your support. You can donate on YouTube, you can subscribe to Byline TV, or indeed buy the next edition of Byline Times, which is all about Putin and Musk and Trump and Farage. We need your support to keep on making these programs with our great producers and contributors. So do, if you can, sign up at Byline TV, donate on YouTube, or buy Byline Times.